As you are aware, this is the Standard Bank Transit Regional Conference. It is the third in its series, and it's a platform to bring our customers in all the 20 African countries, as well as the 6 international markets where we operate together. And so for the 3 days, my expectations are, one, that clients will meet one another and exchange ideas, and that the conversations would then lead to them developing business relationships. I'm expecting, secondly, that in the countries where we are present, the clients that are present in certain countries, we would be able to link them to countries where they want to expand to. And ultimately, thirdly, I'm expecting that these activities and conversations will lead to moving Africa and Africans forward.
So I'd like you to speak to the opportunities that are, in Nigeria regarding trade.
Huge, huge. 200 or so million people, large market, requiring many things, many of which we don't already make here. And so as Africans, where those things are made in other parts of Africa, I expect that a conference like this would encourage movement of such goods and services across the borders in a seamless manner. And as Standard Bank, that is why we are here through Stanbic IBTC to facilitate such movements.
When you look at trade finance generally, and we're looking to see the volume of trade across the continent rise, can you speak to the role of the bank in facilitating this trade to see that these transactions rise to the level that we will be more proud of as Africans?
Yeah, but banks, we're economic agents. And so our role is to empower and facilitate for clients that are involved in producing goods and services. We empower them from the point of giving them access to credit. We empower them from the point of giving them access to processes, as well as linking them to governments and institutions across the borders so that business would be better facilitated.
So when you look at the continent, I can imagine as a banker, there will be a lot of risk associated with trade transactions. I'd like to know what the banks are doing to help de-risk some of these transactions.
There are clearly there are risks involved in any kind and any line of business. And as bankers and economic agents, we have many roles. One of our roles is to facilitate thought leadership. Thought leadership is the role we play when we engage with government authorities, regulators, as well as agencies that make trade happen. So we use our connections, our relationships, and the fact that we are present on ground in those 20 African countries that I mentioned. We use our experience and our connections to open doors to make things more seamless.
So when you look at the continent, some of the complaints we get regarding trade is the fact that the continent doesn't have the right level of infrastructure to facilitate trade. And I would like to know what banks, or more or less the private sector and governments, how they can work together to ensure that we get this infrastructure to the level that is needed.
Yeah, both parties have roles to play. The government, we expect, would give level playing field and the right environment. So let me give an example. Amongst the African countries, if you've tried to move across borders, it could be challenging. And it's easier sometimes to go to Europe than to go to an African country, sadly. So a key role that a government and government agencies can play is to make it less painful so that African businessmen and women will be able to move more freely. On the part of the private sector, we are looking for opportunities, and as long as those opportunities exist, there are markets in the various places, there are goods and services that people need, people are looking for employment. Our role as private sector operators is to keep people employed, provide those goods and services, and then sell to the markets that are waiting.
When you look at policy and the level of policy consistency we're seeing on the continent, how would you like to see this facilitate trade?
I think there's inconsistency owing to many things, including lack of continuity. Oftentimes when governments change in African countries, you see that the policies, even many that are credible and beneficial, are maybe discontinued for some time. So what one would expect is that governments in Africa see development, whether in infrastructure, whether in business, as a continuum, so that once we make up our minds that certain things are desirable, whether governments come or go, we expect that those things will continue to focus on them. If we can't be consistent over a 15, 20-year period, then we are likely to make quicker progress as Africans.
When we look at the landscape of trade in Africa and even globally, we're seeing on one hand the Africa Free Trade Agreements are being ratified by countries as we speak. On the other hand, we're also seeing the single air transport market, coming on board. When you look at the opportunities for this trade, also, lest I forget, when you look at the tensions between the United States and China, I would like to get your response to how you think Africa should be positioning, regarding trade, especially Nigeria.
Well, one thing that is clear in my mind is that I'm not sure that Africa can be as protective as some of those countries you've mentioned. I suspect that at the stage of our development, we still need help somewhat, and therefore we cannot afford to have closed borders. Obviously, there are areas we have competitive advantage. We have a market. I think those areas we should develop our markets and find the edge to be very, very competitive. But there are also areas where we need assistance, whether in technology and in new ways of doing things. I don't think we can close our borders. But clearly, there's a big market. So for instance, in food production, there's plenty land in Africa, arable land. There's no reason why over a medium to long-term period, we shouldn't focus on self-sufficiency. So my point is that we must choose those areas where we would be defensive, but we cannot afford to close the borders, because at this stage, there's still things that we can find very useful and areas that we can receive help from elsewhere.
So as we leave here, I'd like you to speak to what you think your key takeaways from the conference will be.
Thank you. Standard Bank, we are the biggest bank of African origin. We are the biggest bank by asset in Africa. We are present, like you've heard many speakers confirm, in 20 African countries, including South Africa. We are present in 6 international markets. What we seek is to connect these markets so that we can empower Africans, African individuals, African businesses, African governments to achieve their dreams. So our conference over the next 3 days, I'm expecting would get us closer to that objective.